Hey, and welcome to Woke the Channel. This is where we're really woke, not that fake-ass Marxist woke, but we go deep kind of woke. If you want to know what I'm talking about, just check out Woke the movie. I put it out in January this year, and it sort of takes you from A to Z. And what I'm doing in these extra videos is kind of going over the stuff that couldn't really fit in the movie. This is part 2 of our Egypt series. I suggest you go out and check out part 1. I'll leave the link in the description. And just to recap, in that video, we looked at the age of the Sphinx and sort of the water erosion that suggests that this thing is not like 4,500 years old as the Egyptian experts say, but possibly from the Ice Age, because the last time there was that much water on the Sphinx, at least 12,000 years ago when we were coming out of the last Ice Age. So it's a little bit of a predicament for those guarding the narrative. We also looked at the hieroglyphs and how the quality of the statues, the sarcophagi, the temple walls doesn't match the crappy quality of the hieroglyphs that are written on it. I mean, if you had tools for really fine work, then you had tools to make good art on the fine work. So what that suggests is that this stuff is actually older, and the hieroglyphs used to date it are much more recent. But that's not all. We're going to look at some more stuff in Egypt today. And I think Egypt is a really good way to get into this idea of a lost civilization, that there was something more advanced than what we've been told that got lost. And the evidence in Egypt is so obvious that I think it's the best way to get into it if you're a noob on this. So check out video 1. For the second part, we're going to leave Giza and we're going to go 340 miles south to the city of Abydos, where you have this structure, which is called the Assyrion. And it's dated to be about 3,300 years old, according to official dating. 33. It's always interesting when you hear 33, right? But this is said to be part of the funeral complex of the Temple of Set. And you can see the funeral complex right next to it. It's above ground. The Assyrion is below ground and often floods from the Nile. But was this all built at the same time, just as Egyptology says? Well, I have some doubts. If you look at the Assyrion, it's way underground, and that usually is an indication that something's older than above ground. The stone was quarried from 200 miles away in the Aswan quarry. There's no stone anywhere near this site that could be responsible for building it. So the Egyptologists say this was put on rafts and shipped 200 miles south. And is that against the current? I don't know. When you look at it closely, you see a few things that do not match the Temple of Set that is right next to it. You have these interlocking notches, which is a very specific type of construction, and you actually see this not on the tourist attraction temples. You see this in Peru. This style is all over Peru, and it's kind of said to help protect against earthquakes. So I'll leave it at that. It's a very interesting place. We're also going to look at this monument, which is called the Unfinished Pyramid of Zawayet, and you could see that the Egyptologist says it's an unfinished pyramid, but who knows? Here you can see what it looked like in the 1950s in a film called Land of the Pharaohs. Now this place is quite interesting. It's got 15-foot rose granite blocks, also from a quarry about 200 miles away. And you can see the sarcophagus and the stone lid, which does remind you of something out of South America once again. I'm kind of thinking that there was a connection between what you see in Peru and what you see in Egypt. And we'll kind of go through that in more detail in subsequent videos. Another interesting thing is that there's no hieroglyphs. If you've seen any temple in Egypt, hieroglyphs everywhere, right? And we sort of talked about that in the last video. But since this was buried, I don't know if whoever wrote the hieroglyphs on the other monuments got to this place before it was excavated. This thing was discovered in 1904 by an Australian archaeologist, and he called it, quote, an awe-inspiring shock. And he also said, quote, nowhere is the power and mastery of the old Egyptian architects so suddenly and strongly obvious as it is here. So it's not just some crappy temple. This archaeologist thought it was the pinnacle of Egyptian engineering. So you think this would be a huge tourist spot, right? It would be there to help out the local economy, but no. If you look at this today, it's actually in the confines of an Egyptian military base. You won't believe this. This giant pit right here is currently being used as a garbage dump where the military dumps their garbage in there, then the sand blows on it, covers up, and so forth. So I guess you could say this is a literal cover-up. Why isn't this thing public? It's kind of a mystery, and I kind of think it's because it goes against the Egyptian narrative. So what else in Egypt is mysterious? Well, what about the pyramids, right? The three pyramids on the Giza Plateau are the most famous of the Egyptian structures. So were they built like the Egyptologists said they were, or is something else different? Well, it's a little complicated. Let's take the Great Pyramid, for example. Egyptologists say it's about 4,500 years old. That's derived from carbon dates, from garbage that was found around the site, as well as mortar in between the blocks. This Great Pyramid's pretty amazing if you don't mind me saying so. First off, it was supposed to be a burial chamber for the pharaoh Khufu, but no bodies or inscriptions were ever found in the pyramid. It kind of flies in the face of what we've been told about Egypt. We're told that these kings had big egos and they decorated all the walls with stories of their greatness, right? But nothing here. And Khufu's kind of an enigmatic fellow himself. The only other piece of evidence that we know that Khufu existed is a tiny little statue that's about 4 inches long. I mean, for a king with a big ego that wanted this giant pyramid to be buried in, there's very little to go on that he even existed. Also, the Great Pyramid is 1/20th of a degree facing true north, which is pretty amazing considering that this was 4,500 years ago. Also, there's a controversial claim that the three pyramids in Giza, along with pyramids in China and Mexico, are all in alignments with Orion's belt. You could see sort of comparison here, which, I could take or leave it. It could just be it could be a coincidence, but it does seem to match the layout of Orion's belt. But I'll leave that up to you to decide. And what's also amazing about this is that not many people know this. The Great Pyramid is actually an 8-sided pyramid. Take a look from the top view, you can kind of see the 8 sides here. And this thing was so precisely engineered. The only time of the year that you could tell that it was 8-sided, meaning the sun would hit one of the sides and the other side would be in shadow, would be on the sunrise and sunset of the spring equinox. Any other day, it's really hard to tell that it's an 8-sided pyramid. Also, what's interesting with the Great Pyramid is its relation to the number 432. And if you watched the last Egypt video, I introduced Graham Hancock, author and researcher. Awesome guy. He's sort of the granddaddy of this hypothesis that civilization existed during the last ice age. I really recommend you check out his work. And here he is talking about the dimensions of the Great Pyramid.
I don't want to get too numerical or possibly even boring here, but if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid accurately and multiply that measurement by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. In other words, for thousands of years, through times, through dark ages, when human beings didn't even know they lived on a planet, never mind its dimensions, that monument has encoded and speaks out the dimensions of our planet on a scale of 1 to 43,200. And the scale is not random. The number 43,200 is derived from a key motion of the Earth, which is called the precession of the Earth's axis. The Earth wobbles on its axis very slowly, at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. And 43,200 is a multiple of 72. In fact, I think it's 600 times 72, but I need to double check that. But it's a multiple of 72. Check it out. So they've given us the dimensions of our planet on a scale defined by the planet itself. And that's an incredibly clever thing to do.
Now, the number 432 is also interesting in tuning of music. I don't know if you know this, but most music historically was tuned to 432 hertz. And just recently, I guess in the 20th century, it's kind of been in fashion to not tune it in 432 hertz, but tune it into 440 hertz, which I think changed with the Nazi government. Hitler's government changed the music tuning to 440 instead of 432. And I think just recently, some organization in charge of setting the musical standards switched it from 432 to 440. Most music purists hated this move, and they still tune their instruments to 432, which they claim gives you a more sort of pleasant sound, and that 440 is kind of disharmonic. It's hard to tell. You gotta have a really good ear to notice the difference. And, people get a little conspiratorial saying it's done to sort of throw us off a little bit. And you can even look at the cymatics. Every frequency has a sort of wave signature. And look at the comparison of 432 versus 440. Much more order in the 432 wave, or the cymatic pattern, than the 440. It's kind of all over the place. And I wonder if it's a coincidence why music sucks mostly today. I try to find good music and it's harder and harder. So this Great Pyramid thing, super, super interesting. Regardless of when it's built, it's still amazing. But pyramids themselves are not that special, and they're not really attributed to Egypt. Egypt doesn't even have the biggest ones. And that's a video for another time. The world is covered in pyramids, gigantic ones that for years people thought were mountains. Then they find out it's an artificial pyramid, and we'll go into a pyramid video later. But now I want to look into how we are told that these buildings were built. I don't want to go in the whole sort of ancient aliens where they were sort of magnetically levitated and stuff. It's not impossible to move very large blocks with primitive technology. You can see this guy here, this guy in Canada. He built an entire replica of Stonehenge using nothing but leverage.
That's a 300-pound block. This is a 1,600-pound block. Not too difficult.
And you could even use this technique to move whole buildings.
And it was more or less, what else can we move? And he looked at me and says, hey, can we move your barn? And I said, sure, let's, next thing you know, it was 300 feet in the other direction onto another piece of property.
And you could even cut the stone with modern saws. It's a little bit of a workout, but it works. It gets the job done. But let's look at how these were cut with the tools that actually existed in ancient Egypt, so we're told. Here you can see a demonstration where Mark Lehner, who's in charge of excavations and mapping of the Giza Plateau, here he's trying to build a 1/4 replica of the nose of the Sphinx with the tools they had in ancient Egypt, mainly copper chisels and stone hammers. So let's see how successful Mark Lehner is in reconstructing the nose of the Sphinx.
After days of work, their copper chisels and stone pounders are barely making a dent. The copper chisel the ancient Egyptians would have used lasts only a few dozen strikes. The heating pounding cycle is repeated over and over.
Are you ready? I'm ready. Go.
Until the shape is just right.
They must have amassed more copper for building the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx than just about any place in the world in the 3rd millennium BC. I mean, it just must have been a huge cost in copper.
So what this genius should have known is that no caches of copper chisels like he claims have been found. And that's a claim that someone like Mark Lehner should have known. But also this experiment turned out to be a big failure. They actually had to bring in modern tools, and it still took 2 weeks to finish. So another tool that's also responsible for creating all these magnificent monuments is the copper sandsaw. Now, copper is a relatively soft metal. They didn't have steel, they didn't have alloys back then. But if you use sand with the copper, supposedly you could cut stones harder than the saw used to cut it. Here's Mark Lehner demonstrating that technique.
Now, Dennis, will we see any progress in our lifetime?
Yes, if you came back in an hour's time, you would see about a 4 millimeter cut down into the stone.
You're kidding. In an hour, you'll be 4 millimeters down.
The sign went wonderful once we switched over to using water with the sand.
As you can see here, we achieved this in just a few days.
So this seems pretty unrealistic. You'd spend several days even chopping one block to size, not to mention that there's millions of blocks. And it's not just these pyramids in Giza. Egypt is covered in hundreds of pyramids. We're discovering more all the time. So I'd say this method is pretty unrealistic for creating everything. And also when you look at some of the other cut stones with these nice curves and 90-degree angles, I don't know how you do this with the copper sandsaw. And to top it off, not one of these saws has ever been found. So this is all theoretical. And even in the Egyptian art, the only saws you see are these sort of small handheld wood saws. This type of saw might not even exist. Well, that's it for today. I'll be back with more videos about lost civilizations, about the occult, about the satanic elite, about aliens. There's a lot to cover, guys. So subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay tuned for more stuff. Take care.